Picture yourself sitting quietly near a window in the evening, the light fading slowly, the house settling into stillness. In that kind of quiet, a question sometimes rises on its own, not dramatic, just soft and wondering. What if the people we've lost aren't entirely gone? Tonight, Dr. Lana Tate, a neuroscientist who has spent years studying what the brain does at the edge of life, offers some answers that most textbooks haven't caught up with yet. Is calm, truth-seeking stories help you breathe a little easier at night? You'll feel right at home here. There's a particular detail she discovered, one that keeps showing up in case after case, and it changes the way this conversation ends entirely. The last words scientists could not explain. There is a kind of stillness in hospital rooms that feels different from ordinary quiet. Heavier, slower, like time itself is paying attention. Nurses who work night shifts in palliative care often describe a strange awareness that comes over patients in their final hours. A sudden calm, a lifting of the face, words spoken clearly to someone only they seem to see. These moments have been quietly documented for generations, passed between caregivers and whispers, never quite making it into formal reports until recently. Dr. Lana Tate's research team began collecting these accounts not as ghost stories, but as neurological data. What they found was that in the hours before death, certain patients, even those who had been unconscious or unresponsive for days, would speak full, coherent sentences. Not rambling, not confused. Specific sentences, often directed at someone by name. The brains of these patients, when monitored, showed surges of organized electrical activity that shouldn't have been possible given their condition. What made these words so difficult for the scientific community to simply dismiss was their consistency. Across different hospitals, different countries, different languages, patients said remarkably similar things. They described seeing figures. They expressed surprise, then recognition. And in several documented cases, the name they called out belonged to someone who had died years before, someone the attending staff had no way of knowing about. The pattern was too clean to be random. She died twice and remembered everything. A woman in her late 60s was brought into a cardiac unit after collapsing in her garden on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had been pruning roses. Twice during resuscitation, her heart stopped completely. Twice, it was restarted. When she regained consciousness the following day, she did something that puzzled the medical team. She asked why her sister had been standing in the corner of the room. Because her sister had died 11 years earlier. She wasn't distressed. She was curious, almost gently amused. What makes this account scientifically interesting isn't the vision itself. It's what her brain was doing at the moment she saw it. In cases where EEG monitoring was active during cardiac arrest, researchers have recorded gamma wave bursts, the same high-frequency brainwaves associated with vivid dreaming and conscious awareness, firing intensely at the precise moment the heart stops. This contradicts the long-held assumption that a dying brain simply powers down. Something else appears to be happening, something organized, something purposeful. The woman remembered the temperature of the room. She remembered the color of light. She remembered feeling, in her own words, recognized, as though whatever she encountered already knew her completely. These emotional textures are what separate near-death accounts from ordinary hallucinations. Drug-induced visions tend to be chaotic, fragmented, difficult to recall. These accounts are the opposite, unusually clear, unusually calm, and they tend to stay with people for the rest of their lives without fading. A gentleman named Harold, who listened to a story very much like this one while sitting in his favorite armchair, later wrote in to say that his late wife had told him something similar from her hospital bed. He had never told anyone because he didn't know what to do with it. He said that hearing it described in calm, careful language was the first time he felt the experience deserved to be taken seriously. And that in itself was its own kind of quiet relief. What happens inside the brain at death? The human brain uses roughly 20 watts of power to run, about the same as a dim bedside lamp. And yet, in its final moments, it appears to burn far brighter than that. Researchers studying the dying brain have found that in the seconds following cardiac arrest, there is a surge of neural communication that outpaces anything recorded during normal waking life. Regions of the brain that process meaning, memory, and self-awareness suddenly begin talking to each other at extraordinary speed. Whatever the brain is doing at the end, it is not resting. Dr. Lana Tate has described this phenomenon with particular care, noting that the surge doesn't look like a system crashing. It looks more like a system completing something. The analogy she uses is simple. Imagine a letter that has been half written for an entire lifetime, and in those last moments, it is finally, rapidly finished. The content of that letter, whatever the brain encodes in those final seconds, may be what some people later describe as seeing a whole life pass before them. Not as chaos, but as something that finally makes sense. There is one detail that keeps appearing in the neuroscience that most casual summaries leave out. The surge does not happen uniformly across the brain. It concentrates in regions associated with love, recognition, and belonging. Not fear, not pain. The architecture of what the brain chooses to amplify at the end is on its own one of the quietest and most astonishing things in all of modern science. As we go deeper into this video, the conversation shifts from what the brain does to what it may be reaching toward, and that distinction turns out to matter in ways most people never consider. The message that arrived 3 days later. There are families who describe receiving something, a phone call, a letter, a visit, that carries a weight they cannot fully explain, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precisely specific. A daughter in Scotland received a voicemail from her mother's disconnected phone 3 days after her mother's funeral. The message was a single breath and a familiar humming, the same song her mother had always hummed while cooking Sunday dinner. The phone company confirmed the line had been inactive. The recording existed. The song was correct. Researchers who study what are called after-death communications, ADCs, have cataloged thousands of such accounts. What is striking is not the unusual ones, but the ordinary ones. Most don't involve disconnected phones or strange lights. Most happen in the quiet, a sudden familiar scent in an empty room, a dream so vivid it feels more like a visit than a dream, a thought that arrives in a voice that sounds distinctly like someone else. These are not experiences people tend to invent. They are experiences people tend to keep private because they cannot explain them and they don't want to seem foolish. The 3-day window appears in these accounts with unusual frequency. Researchers who have studied grief across cultures have noticed that families from vastly different backgrounds with no shared religious belief independently report that something tends to happen in the first 72 hours. Not always, but often enough to make the pattern worth sitting with quietly, without needing to rush toward an explanation. Families who heard voices no one else did. An elderly man named George, sitting alone in his kitchen 2 weeks after losing his wife of 51 years, heard his name spoken clearly, in her voice. He was not asleep. The television was off. The house was empty. He sat very still, he later told his daughter, because he didn't want to startle whatever had just arrived. This kind of experience is reported far more often than most people realize. Studies suggest that somewhere between 40 and 80% of bereaved spouses report a similar moment in the weeks following a loss. What neuroscience offers here is not a dismissal, but a different kind of curiosity. The brain of a grieving person is, in a very measurable sense, still in relationship with the person it lost. Neural pathways built over decades of love and habit don't dissolve on the day of a funeral. They remain active, searching, reaching, and some researchers, including those in Dr. Tate's extended circle of colleagues, are beginning to ask whether those pathways might, under certain conditions, function as something closer to a receiver than a generator. The voice George heard said only his name, nothing more. But he describes the quality of it as unmistakably hers. Not a memory of her voice, but her voice, with her particular way of saying the second syllable slightly softer. That level of acoustic specificity is what separates these accounts from wishful thinking. A grieving mind might conjure comfort. It is harder to explain how it conjures precise details that feel received rather than invented. The moment scientists stopped being skeptics, science has a long and healthy habit of skepticism, and that skepticism has protected a great deal of human knowledge from being led astray by feeling alone. But there is a quieter story inside the history of consciousness research, one where some of the most rigorous skeptics in the field change their position not dramatically, but slowly, reluctantly, and honestly. Not because they wanted to believe, because the data kept arriving in the same direction. Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University is one of the most careful researchers in this space. His AWARE study, one of the largest scientific investigations of near-death experiences ever conducted, was designed specifically to test whether people could perceive verifiable information while clinically dead. He entered the project as a skeptic. The results did not give him certainty, but they gave him something more intellectually honest: the admission that the current model of consciousness is incomplete. Something is happening that the existing map does not yet cover. What shifts a skeptic is rarely a single dramatic case. It tends to be accumulation, the 15th account that matches the 14th, the pattern that appears when you weren't looking for it. Researchers describe a particular discomfort that sets in when the evidence stops fitting the theory you came in with. That discomfort, for a good scientist, is not a reason to stop. It is a signal that something real is waiting to be understood. 3 things researchers almost never mention in the headlines. First, the majority of people who report near-death experiences describe returning with a reduced fear of dying, not because of what they believe, but because of what they felt. Second, children who report these experiences tend to describe them with even greater clarity than adults, and without the cultural scripts adults carry. Third, the detail most commonly left out of popular retellings is how quiet these experiences tend to be. Not dramatic, not loud, quiet, warm, and strangely familiar. One signal changed how doctors think forever. In a research hospital in Michigan, a monitoring team noticed something they hadn't been looking for. During the final minutes of a patient's life, with the family gathered, the brain produced a coordinated wave of activity that the team's lead neurologist described simply as organized. Not random firing, not noise, organized. As though somewhere in the brain's last conversation with itself, there was still someone home, still directing the process, still present in a way the body's vital signs no longer confirmed. This finding, later named the hidden consciousness signature, quietly restructured how some palliative care teams now approach their work. In hospitals where this research has reached the staff, there is a growing practice of speaking gently to patients who appear to have no remaining awareness, reading to them, playing familiar music, describing the weather outside the window, not as ritual, but as response to evidence, because the evidence suggests that hearing may remain active long after all other signs of life have dimmed. The implications for families are significant in a way that is hard to measure, but easy to feel. If the brain remains receptive in those final hours, then the words spoken in a hospital room on an ordinary Tuesday, the apologies, the gratitude, the quiet "I love you" said into what seemed like empty air, may not have been spoken into emptiness at all. That possibility alone changes something in the way grief is carried afterward. Children who knew things before being told. A 5-year-old boy in Vermont told his mother that Grandpa's friend Harold had come to visit, and that Harold wanted his wife to know he was sorry about the garden shed. The boy had never met Harold. Harold had died 3 years before the child was born. His wife, still living, confirmed that the last argument she and Harold ever had was about whether to demolish the garden shed. No one in the family had ever spoken of this to the child, or to almost anyone. Children report these experiences more often than adults, and they do so differently. They tend not to frame them as unusual. They treat them as ordinary, the way children treat most things they don't yet know should feel strange. Researchers who study childhood accounts of a parent after-death communication note that the details children provide often include information they have no plausible access to: names, places, private phrases, even physical descriptions of people they never met. The explanations that dismiss these accounts tend to require more assumption than the accounts themselves. What makes childhood cases quietly compelling to researchers is that children have not yet learned what they are supposed to believe. They haven't absorbed the cultural pressure to either embrace or dismiss these experiences. They simply report what arrived, with the same straightforward matter-of-factness they use to describe what they had for breakfast. That absence of agenda in a research context carries a particular weight that is difficult to set aside. The study nobody in medicine wanted published. There is a particular kind of research that takes longer to reach the public, not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient. It disrupts established models, raises questions that existing methods cannot yet cleanly answer, and tends to make funding committees uncomfortable. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies has been quietly producing this kind of research for decades. Their work on apparent communication between the living and the dead is some of the most methodologically careful in the field, and it remains, by most measures, almost entirely unknown outside of specialist circles. One of their most careful studies involved recording spontaneous accounts of contact from bereaved individuals who had not sought the experience, had no particular belief system that would encourage it, and in several cases had actively resisted interpreting it as anything meaningful. The accounts were then cross-referenced with verifiable details, dates, names, circumstances, that the researchers attempted to confirm independently. The confirmation rate in the strongest cases was not 100%, but it was not zero, and it was higher than chance would comfortably allow. The researchers themselves were careful in their language, as careful researchers tend to be. They did not conclude that the dead communicate. They concluded that something was happening in these accounts that existing frameworks, they use the word models, did not yet adequately describe. That distinction may seem small, but in the world of scientific publishing, the gap between we don't know and this deserves continued serious attention is larger than it sounds, and far more honest than silence. A pattern keeps appearing across different countries. A hospice worker in Japan and a grief counselor in Brazil have never met. They work in different languages, in cultures with different beliefs about death and what follows it. And yet, if you place their client notes side by side, certain patterns would feel almost like translations of each other. The sense of a presence in the room, the unexpected calm that descends on the dying person shortly before the end, the impression, felt not just by the patient, but by the people sitting nearby, that something has shifted in the air. Cross-cultural research into these experiences is still in early stages, but the consistency is striking. Researchers from the University of Edinburgh studied accounts from 14 different countries and found that the emotional texture of near-death and post-death contact experiences was remarkably similar, regardless of religious background or cultural expectation. This matters because it argues against the simplest dismissal that people are simply constructing experiences that match what they already believe. Many of the people reporting these experiences held no relevant prior belief at all. The detail that appears most consistently across cultures is not a vision or a voice. It is a feeling of being known, completely and without judgment. People from vastly different traditions describe the same interior quality, not peace exactly, but recognition, as though whatever they encountered during those moments had always been aware of them, had always been present just at the edge of what ordinary life allowed them to notice. That specific feeling, familiar, close, unhurried, does not read like imagination. It reads like memory, what the dying say in their final hours. There is a hospice nurse named Maggie Callanan who spent decades at the bedside of the dying and kept careful notes about what she witnessed. Her observations, eventually published in quiet professional circles, described a phenomenon she called nearing death awareness. It was not mystical, it was clinical. She noticed that dying people frequently began using travel language. They spoke of needing to pack, of waiting for permission to leave, of seeing a path or a door. And she noticed that these images seemed to comfort them deeply, as though something about the metaphor was to them not a metaphor at all. Others have continued her documentation. What emerges is a portrait of the dying person as someone who is, in those last days and hours, having experiences that are simply not well described by the language of illness. They speak of visitors, of light that seems to come from somewhere specific rather than everywhere. A feeling, a pulling, not frightening, but purposeful. The people at the bedside who take these accounts seriously, rather than redirecting or reassuring them away, tend to report that the dying person becomes calmer, clearer, and more at peace as a result of being simply heard. The final words of the dying, across thousands of documented cases, tend to share one quality that is easy to miss if you are listening only for what they say rather than how they say it. They tend to sound like someone finishing a conversation, not beginning one, as though the dialogue has been ongoing for longer than the people in the room are aware of, and what the dying person is doing in those last moments is simply finding the right closing words for an exchange that was never quite interrupted. One of the most overlooked parts of nearing death awareness is how often it seems to happen even when medication levels don't support a simple explanation, like sedation or confusion. Dr. Lana Tate points out that in many recorded cases, the timing is wrong for the drug haze theory, because the clearest moments come when the body should be weakest. Hospice workers describe patients whose speech had been broken for weeks suddenly forming complete thoughts, and not just in a random way, but in a way that feels socially aware, as if they're responding to someone standing in the room. They'll pause as if listening, then answer, then smile, then look toward a corner with a recognition that makes family members freeze. The strange part is the emotional precision. They aren't panicked, they aren't frantic, and they don't talk like someone lost in fever. They talk like someone who has been waiting for a familiar person to arrive, and now that person has finally made it. For families, that calmness becomes unforgettable because it changes the mood of the room from fear to something almost ceremonial. Another pattern that Dr. Tate finds quietly compelling is what happens when families choose to respond instead of correct. When a dying mother says, "My father is here," some relatives instinctively say, "No, he's not," trying to keep her anchored. But in rooms where someone simply says, "Tell me what you see," the entire process often becomes gentler. The patient relaxes, the breathing slows, the face softens, and the travel language becomes less like confusion and more like coordination. As if they're preparing for a transition they can already feel. Some people describe being called by name, others describe being told it isn't time yet, and a few describe what sounds like a reunion schedule. They're waiting, but I'm not going yet. Whether you interpret it spiritually or psychologically, the effect is the same. The person becomes more peaceful, And from a neuroscience standpoint, that piece matters, because it suggests these experiences may be part of the brain's own natural way of guiding someone through the final doorway, not with fear, but with familiarity. The detail most researchers keep quietly noting. There is a detail that appears in the margins of study after study, not in the headlines, not in the press releases, but in the footnotes, the appendices, the careful qualifications that researchers include, almost as though they are surprised by them. It is this: the people who report these experiences, the contact, the voices, the sense of continued presence, do not tend to become dependent on them. They do not chase the experience or try to recreate it. They tend instead to become quieter, more present, less afraid of ordinary life. This is the opposite of what you might expect if these experiences were simply the mind generating comfort to protect itself. Comfort-seeking behavior tends to escalate. It tends to require more of whatever provided relief. But the people who report genuine post-death contact tend to describe it as something that resolved something, a question they hadn't been able to fully form, answered in a way they couldn't quite repeat in language. And they tend to carry the experience not as something that demands explanation, but as something that quietly reorganized the way they move through the days that follow. The researchers who note this, and many of them do, in that careful footnote language, are pointing at something that may be more significant than the experience itself. Whatever is happening in these encounters, its aftermath is measurable in human behavior. People love more easily afterward. They hold grievances less tightly. They describe in various ways and different words a sense that the distance between themselves and the people they have lost is not quite as absolute as the calendar would suggest. And that shift is real, wherever it comes from. Dr. Lana Tate also notes something else that doesn't get talked about much because it doesn't fit either extreme. In follow-up interviews months later, people who reported contact experiences often show less obsession, not more. They don't behave like someone hooked on a supernatural thrill. They behave like someone who received closure in a language deeper than words. Many stop arguing with life in the same frantic way. Their grief doesn't vanish, but it becomes less sharp, less punishing, and what replaces it is not blind belief, but a kind of settled knowing that they are still connected to love itself. The detail that keeps repeating is this: they become less performative. They stop trying so hard to prove themselves. They are more forgiving, but also more boundaried, as if the experience gave them a clearer sense of what matters and what doesn't. If the mind were simply manufacturing comfort, you would expect the comfort to be fragile, needing constant reinforcement. But these people often describe the opposite, that after one single moment, something inside them clicked into place, and life became quieter in the best way. There is no clean ending to a question like this one, and perhaps that is part of what makes it so worth sitting with. Science does not yet have a complete answer. It has data, patterns, honest uncertainty, and researchers who are still leaning in, still taking notes, still surprised by what they find. The people who have lived through these experiences, who heard a voice, who felt a presence, who came back from the edge of death with a memory they can't set down, tend not to need an explanation. They already have something else, something that arrives not as argument, but as the kind of quiet that settles into a room after a long and meaningful conversation. You don't need to have had the experience to sense its outline tonight. It lives in the way a familiar song can move you before you've consciously recognized what it is, in the way a particular quality of evening light can make you feel for just a moment held by something larger and older and gentler than whatever was troubling you this morning. Dr. Lana Tate and the researchers she works alongside are not asking you to believe anything tonight. They are simply suggesting, as carefully as science allows, that the space between living and gone may be softer than we were taught. That the people who mattered to us may be less finished with us than we sometimes feel. On quiet evenings, by fading windows, in the kind of stillness where questions rise on their own, soft and wondering, with no urgency at all,